Hello,
Same.
and welcome to the multi-tenancy working group. Today we are talking about multi-tenant clusters versus multi-cluster versus virtual and nested cluster in preparation for Kubecon. Adrian, do you want to repeat your question?
Why don't you go first and then I'll repeat mine as well?
Yeah, so my question was basically just validating or trying to validate that these three are the three multi-tenancy models we want to propose or think about when we talk about multi-tenancy for Kubernetes. So the first one being sharing a single cluster with namespaces. The second, of course, like spinning up separate clusters, and which is fairly common with cloud-based Kubernetes. And the other one, which is a hybrid, is sharing the control plane perhaps with different, like maybe with virtual clusters, having some components per tenant. And then with nested clusters, I'm actually not sure how exactly that model would differ, but again, there it's sharing some of the control plane, but having per tenant components for other areas.
So
Yeah,
when
and
you say
my follow-up to that was my assumption about virtual clusters was that mainly you were sharing resources, but so the question I was going to give was like, are there any kind of like policy objects that can make it easier for the different virtual clusters in the same shared cluster to communicate with each other, to impose common policies, to impose like different policies?
Yeah, in current design, no, because in current design, we are completely treat the supercluster that are actually running pods as a pod resource provider only. So it only handles pod, provision related resources. All the, management.
You're a little quiet.
Is it getting better?
Yeah, it's better.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. I repeat. So the answer to the Andrew's question is at least in current design is no, because for Jim, nested and virtual are the same thing. So just forget about the nested. So I have to make a compromise about the name. So for the virtual cluster, so we don't handle any. So if you look at the Sinker, we model the super cluster which actually run the pods as a resource provider only. So any control kind of CRD or even API resources, they are not even synced to the supercluster. So there's no way you can set advanced network policy to allow the different tenants to talk each other, unless you completely bypass the Kubernetes default service. You just direct everything to SLB, and if that SLB allows you to talk to multiple pods belongs to different virtual cluster, then you just did that. So, but by default, no. So I try to make this thing simple, as make sure the control plane is completely isolated, and the super cluster just treat it as a pod provisioner. You can just model that way.
So, but the scheduler and the worker nodes are shared. The rest of the control plane is per tenant. Is that correct? Or
exactly?
Okay.
And the network stack is shared because it's one underlying cluster.
Yeah.
I think that raises an interesting question for the multi-cluster use case there, because you could have a tenant with a completely isolated cluster all on their own, or there could be some kind of shared network to having a dedicated cluster, like a shared Istio fabric or something.
Right.
Well, I mean, you could already have that today with multi-cluster with like Sicilium in there,
Yeah,
cross-federated.
So,
right.
So the multi-cluster one could potentially be two different types. One where it's completely separate clusters, and one where there's like network federation at least.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay. Yeah. So I don't know. Like, I don't recall if we have this written up somewhere, but it may be interesting just even in preparation for Kubecon or independently to maybe take a stab at defining these models and what each one means. One of the other reasons I was thinking of that is, someone was asking me about, we had looked at Loft as an example of, I think, the third model, the virtual clusters. So there's more, I think there's more examples showing up in either commercial or other open source tools and projects.
Yeah, I think it makes sense, especially for the people, like, I don't know the answer to those networking questions. I'd love to hear them, but we don't have to hash it out today. I think that these are good things for us to talk about in the panel discussion that we pre-record. So I don't know if
It would be a good blog post too. Yeah.
that's a good point. Yeah.
I know that we have a ton of documentation because I had to write the multi-tenancy yearly report that you all saw kind of fly by. And every time they asked me, what about this? What about this? I just had to go look at like our copious amounts of documentation, but I'd forgotten that half of it existed. So if we think about like what we want to define about the different models, I can go kind of look at what we've already written up and then we'll kind of see the gaps. I know that Faye has written a lot of blog posts about virtual cluster too. So it may just be that we need to kind of take it and I'll put it in one place, but it would be a good blog post write up, I think.
Does Admiralty fit under the virtual cluster thing?
Does what?
Yeah, I think. So, oh, it's a KFox. Okay. So if you read my issue, I think I replied that issue. I explained the differences. Yeah. I personally think, again, if you use virtual kubelet, if you connect a virtual kubelet to Kubernetes, which doesn't make sense to me.
But it has the same, it's not necessarily the ideal implementation, but I think it still fits the model where you have one control plane that's ending up launching pods in a different Kubernetes cluster.
Well, that's basically what KubeFed is meant to solve, isn't it?
Except KubeFed has a different API. You're creating KubeFed objects that then create native Kubernetes objects in other clusters. Whereas Admiralty, when it goes to schedule a pod in the one control plane, it then takes the pod and copies it and creates it in another cluster.
So if you look at a high level model wise, I would say yes, they are kind of very similar to VC. So I don't think I want to argue about that. So if you asking whether they are achieving the same isolation, compatibility, I would say yes. It's all just the implementation decision.
Yeah.
I agree with that. Completely agree with that. So yeah, because high level model is just a dedicated control plan. Make sure the Kubernetes API is fully compatible, which I'm not exactly sure the Admiralty can achieve that if they use virtual Kubernetes. I would assume some of them. Yeah, that's my. Other than that, I would say no problem. As another key difference is the node semantic. But I think about not a very. That's not a key to the multi-tenancy, but it's all about the user experience. But I don't want to comment on that.
Yeah, and Admiralty was built for kind of the multi-cluster use case. So it's not really exactly intended for the virtual cluster use case, but I think it can work for it too.
Depends on the use case. If you don't care about node semantic, they are the same. You can go with that because
high
level user perspective, they have a dedicated API server, and that's all about it.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the project. I was just looking it up. It's interesting.
Has anyone looked at Liqu or Liqo? Liqo? I just saw a post on Reddit like last week, and I haven't actually got a chance to look into it. But it sounds like it's somewhat similar to Admiralty, almost. But it doesn't use the virtual kubelet, I don't think. Anyway, so back to like the discussion points, Tasha. I wanted to kind of point out that we don't really none of the discussion points really talk about how to choose if a multi-tenancy or multi-cluster is right for you, which is, I mean, almost impossible for us to actually give any guidance on, but I don't know if it's worth.
I think that's very important.
Yeah, because that's what most people want to know, right? How do you know?
Because nobody cares what is multi-tenancy. Just everybody cares how to resolve my use case, which one I should choose.
Yeah.
Tell me which one to use, and
Yeah,
I think even
some
more
reference,
contentious is
some reference examples or some,
Yeah.
reference architectures.
Or a flow chart, like a decision flow chart. Like that's sometimes something that I've used before is like, this is the like multi-cluster gives you this kind of isolation. Do you need that kind of isolation? Yes. Well, then you're doing multi-cluster. Do you not need that kind of isolation and you want to save costs? Well, then don't do that. It's like, so I think, I mean,
well, yeah, I mean, yeah. Unfortunately too, like, I mean, in the model tenancy, sure, but like multi-cluster also becomes a question of like, eventually if you grow to sizes or, you need to, like, for us, we have to be multi-cluster because our data can't leave the country of origin, and, certain countries don't have AWS. So we have to, solve those issues as well. So.
Can I talk to you about federated machine learning, Ryan?
Sure. Are you gonna provide the lunch? Send me a DoorDash coupon or something?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Maybe we should use this kind of decision tree to drive the discussion, because every time you make a choice, you have to say, why have I made a choice? Because A model doesn't fit, B model fit it, but in what sense? So I think with kind of flow can drive the discussion more concentrated, not spread to just go wide.
And also focus on also mention the fact that it can change over time, right? Like we've seen this a bunch, is that somebody starts on multi-cluster because it's quick and easy and cheap-ish to get started. And then later on, there's some consolidation that happens because they now have enough experience. They think they can do it safely and they want to get the cost savings. And the more advanced, things like network policies and stuff like that. So just because you pick an answer now doesn't mean it's your answer forever.
Exactly, but I think the consensus should be most likely always there, but just the answer may be different.
Sorry, what was that, Bay?
I mean, the consensus, the requirement may be the same, but the answer may be different. So.
Yes, absolutely. So.
Yeah, and very often in enterprises, you will see a mix of all of these models, right? So it's not just one or the other.
Yeah, I can provide tons of questions I have been asked for VC because I have to push it very hard to make it into production. So I got a lot of questions from production team. So about the consensus. So I can provide that aspect for sure. But for namespace, I still think you guys maybe Adrian, you already have some questions for people. If they choose as HNC, you probably already answered some of the questions. Why using HNC is okay, it's good enough for your use case. Do they address their concerns? So I really believe I mean there are cases people just say that VC is too costly. I don't want to spend money on the control plane. So as I said, yes. Yeah. So I agree. So in my opinion, so VC is kind of fit for larger organizations. So it's not very good for small scales. If you only have a few users or even tens of users, may not good enough. I mean namespace may be good enough. So it's not saying that multi-cluster. In many cases, multi-cluster. I don't know how you guys see the multi-cluster, why they have to be there in one organization. But in my cases, at least I have seen cases multi-cluster that is, for example, in edge use case, they have to have multiple clusters because they are geography different. But using one cluster to management all small clusters, which makes sense to me. Other than that, I don't know. I heard from Apple, from Chris, that Apple it sounds weird, but that's what he said, saying that adding a node to a cluster is difficult, but creating a cluster is easy. So which means
Odd.
yeah.
I think they're largely on-prem though, right? So I'm sure they want their servers close to each other, and if they're already allocated, it's hard to add to a rack close to it from latency. That'd be my guess.
Yeah,
That's my pure out of thin air, but yeah.
I'll just
Yeah,
ask a question. We've got a hard stop in 5 minutes, I believe.
Yeah.
So anything else that anybody wants to discuss?
Just one more quick challenge there. If you have automation around launching VMs, then multi-cluster is easier in some ways. Whereas if you have bare metal and not easy provisioning of it, then multi-tenant shared cluster can be easier. It depends on your provisioning infrastructure.
In our use case too, right, is anything that runs on our cluster that touches PHI data needs to go through proper vetting. So we have 2 clusters, one for PHI data and one for not. And like, and then the not, we can do HNC and kind of segregate things that way. But and then same with the PHI, but like we still need multi-cluster for that, just because otherwise we're constantly every single upstream code change needs to go through documentation funness. So yeah. So I guess like regulations are another kind of use case, but we use both, right? We are planning to use HNC and multi-cluster. So
regulations are like security policies or network. Yeah.
Right.
I think this is I just wanted to mention one thing on a separate topic from this. So thank you to Ryan for getting HNC our own repo. We haven't switched to it yet, but yay, Ryan, that was awesome. Thanks for doing that.
Yeah, there's still one PR. We're still waiting for somebody to approve the PR to be an official sub-project. There's like a PR to be a sig-auth, like it's just in the YAML, like we're there, but like there's a PR for the YAML, but we have the repo. And so Faye, I was actually going to reach out to you after this since you've been slowly getting virtual cluster out. I was wondering what your process was to preserve Git history without muddling everything.
Yeah, I wanted to know about the history as well.
So we can nerd out about that at another time. I'm sure nobody wants to see that on a YouTube recording of how we're going to do that.
It becomes like a cult favorite. If you're trying to figure out how to preserve Git history, you have to go to like 22 minutes into this recording on YouTube.
No, because then I guess we'll talk about it, and then I guess we'll have like 6 people telling us what we did wrong. So maybe it's worth it.
Yeah. Cool.
The one place it's documented.